I thought I was being introduced as his mother, but when I walked into that boardroom and heard my own son tell his business partners that I was just the help, I realized that the empire I'd quietly built behind the scenes was about to become his biggest nightmare. What he didn't know was that every dollar flowing through his precious company had my name written all over it, and I was about to teach him a lesson about respect that would cost him everything he thought he owned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, though most people who know me from my professional life call me Maggie. At 62, I've spent the better part of 4 decades building what most would consider a quiet but substantial business empire. I own a chain of commercial laundromats throughout the Pacific Northwest, 3 apartment complexes in Seattle, and hold silent partnerships in more restaurants and retail spaces than I care to count. The irony isn't lost on me that while my son David thinks I've spent my life washing other people's clothes, I've actually been cleaning up in the real estate and service industry game. I never intended for my wealth to remain such a well-kept secret, but somewhere along the way, David formed his own narrative about who his mother was, and I found it easier to let him believe it than to constantly prove myself. When his father walked out on us when David was 12, I was running 2 laundromats and working 16-hour days to keep us afloat. David saw the uniforms, the late nights, the smell of industrial detergent that seemed permanently embedded in my clothes, and he drew his conclusions. What he didn't see were the business meetings I attended after he went to bed, the property acquisitions I negotiated while he was at school, or the investment decisions that slowly but steadily built our financial security. By the time David graduated high school, I owned 8 laundromats and had purchased my first rental property. When he left for college at Northwestern, I was already diversifying into commercial real estate. The monthly checks I sent him for tuition, living expenses, and his endless requests for spending money came from accounts he never asked about. I suppose I enabled this willful ignorance because part of me enjoyed watching him succeed without the burden of feeling like he owed his achievements to anyone else. David graduated with a business degree and immediately announced his intention to start his own consulting firm. He had big dreams about building something from the ground up, proving himself in the corporate world, making his own mark. I admired his ambition, even as I recognized the naivety behind it. Starting a business requires more than enthusiasm and a diploma. It requires capital, connections, and the kind of street-smart wisdom that comes from years of watching deals go sideways. When he approached me about borrowing money to get his consulting firm off the ground, I didn't hesitate. He needed $200,000 for office space, equipment, initial staffing, and operating expenses for the first year. What surprised me wasn't the amount he was asking for, but how he asked. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped him with homework for years, and laid out his business plan with the kind of nervous energy that reminded me of the little boy who used to practice his school presentations in front of the mirror. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask," he began, sliding a folder across the table, "but I've run the numbers, and I really think this could work. I just need someone to believe in me enough to take a chance." I opened the folder and found a surprisingly thorough business plan. He'd clearly put significant thought into market analysis, projected revenues, and operational costs. What struck me most was how carefully he'd calculated exactly how much he thought he could borrow from his mother, who ran a few laundromats. He'd actually underestimated what I could afford to lend him by about a factor of 10. "This looks very promising, sweetheart," I told him, studying his projected timelines. "I think we can make this work." His relief was immediate and overwhelming. He actually teared up sitting there at the kitchen table, and for a moment, I saw the little boy, who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken toys, confident that Mom could fix anything. I wrote him a check that afternoon, and we shook hands like business partners. He promised to pay me back within 5 years with interest, though I had no intention of ever collecting on that debt. What I didn't expect was how quickly he would distance himself from the source of his startup capital once his business began to succeed. Within 6 months, David had landed 3 major corporate clients and hired a small team of consultants. His office in downtown Seattle's financial district was everything he'd dreamed of: glass walls, modern furniture, a conference room with a view of Elliott Bay. He threw himself into building his brand with the kind of intensity that reminded me of myself in my early days, working those 16-hour shifts to keep the laundromats profitable. The first time I visited his office, he seemed genuinely excited to show me around. He introduced me to his assistant, gave me a tour of the space, and explained his vision for expanding the firm's services. I was proud watching him navigate conference calls and review client presentations. This was the life I'd worked so hard to make possible for him, and seeing him thrive in it felt like the culmination of decades of careful financial planning. But as his success grew, something subtle began to shift in how he talked about his background. When clients or colleagues asked about his family, I noticed he became vague about my profession. Instead of saying his mother owned a chain of laundromats, he'd mention that I worked in the service industry or ran a small local business. It wasn't exactly dishonest, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I told myself this was natural. Young professionals often feel pressure to present themselves as self-made, especially in competitive fields like business consulting. I'd seen it happen with other successful people I knew. The tendency to minimize their family's financial contributions once they achieved their own recognition. I convinced myself that David's reluctance to discuss my businesses was just his way of establishing independence, not embarrassment about where his opportunities had come from. The real shift happened about 18 months after his firm launched. David had grown his team to 12 employees and was consistently landing contracts with Fortune 500 companies. His success was undeniable, and I was genuinely proud of what he'd accomplished. But when he started talking about taking out business loans to expand further, instead of coming to me for additional capital, I realized something fundamental had changed in how he viewed our relationship. "I want to prove I can do this on my own," he explained during one of our monthly dinners. "The initial loan from you was amazing, Mom, and I'll always be grateful. But now I need to show potential investors that I can secure traditional financing." I understood the logic, even as I felt a small sting of disappointment. There's something uniquely painful about being relegated to initial loan status when you've spent years building the kind of wealth that could have funded his expansion 10 times over without affecting your own financial security. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I supported his decision because I wanted him to feel ownership over his achievements. What I didn't anticipate was how this desire for independence would gradually morph into something that felt more like shame about his origins. The monthly dinners became less frequent. When I did see him, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone for messages from clients or investors. Our conversations shifted from family updates and shared experiences to his professional challenges and industry insights. I found myself feeling more like an audience for his success stories than a participant in his life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. David had called me the week before to invite me to a client presentation at his office. One of his biggest clients, a tech startup looking to go public, wanted to meet with his entire team to discuss a major consulting contract. He'd mentioned that several potential investors would be there, and he thought I might enjoy seeing him in action in a high-stakes business environment. I was genuinely excited about the invitation. It had been months since I'd spent any significant time at his office, and I was curious about the kinds of projects he was working on. I dressed carefully for the occasion, a navy blazer and slacks that I thought struck the right balance between professional and maternal. I wanted to represent him well in front of his colleagues and clients. The presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but I arrived a few minutes early and waited in the lobby. David's office had expanded since my last visit, taking over additional floor space and adding a larger conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see him setting up presentation materials and reviewing notes with his team. He looked confident and prepared, every inch the successful business consultant he'd worked so hard to become. At exactly 2 o'clock, the elevator doors opened and a group of well-dressed professionals stepped into the lobby. I recognized them immediately as the clients and investors David had mentioned. There was an energy about them that suggested serious money and high-level decision-making. David emerged from the conference room to greet them, shaking hands and making introductions with the kind of polished professionalism that made me proud to be his mother. That's when I heard the conversation that would change everything between us. One of the investors, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and an expensive handbag, glanced in my direction and asked David, "Is that woman waiting for someone? Should we let her know the building lobby isn't really meant for extended waiting?" David followed her gaze to where I was sitting, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. He knew I was there for his presentation. He knew I was his mother. And he knew these people were the kind of high-net-worth individuals he'd been working months to impress. "Oh, her?" David said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "That's just the help. She's probably waiting for someone upstairs. Don't worry about it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat frozen in the lobby chair, watching as David ushered his clients into the conference room without so much as a glance in my direction. Just the help. After everything I'd done to build his success, after the years of financial support and encouragement, after the $200,000 that had made his entire business possible, I had been reduced to just the help in front of the people he was trying to impress. I stayed in that lobby chair for the full hour of his presentation, watching through the glass walls as my son charmed potential investors and outlined expansion plans for a business that literally wouldn't exist without my money. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, dismissed as hired help, while sitting 20 feet away from a conference room where my son was pitching business strategies funded entirely by the woman he'd just pretended not to know. When the presentation ended and the clients began filing out, several of them glanced at me with the kind of polite indifference reserved for service workers. One man even nodded and smiled, the way people do when they want to acknowledge someone's presence without actually engaging. I smiled back and watched them leave, my mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. David emerged from the conference room looking triumphant. The presentation had clearly gone well, and he was energized by what seemed to be positive responses from the potential investors. He was so focused on discussing next steps with his team that he still hadn't acknowledged my presence in the lobby. I finally stood up and walked over to where he was standing near the elevator. "Bank, David," I said quietly, not wanting to interrupt his conversation with colleagues but needing to establish that I was there for a reason. He turned, and I watched his face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise that I was still there, discomfort that I was approaching him in front of his team, and something that looked almost like annoyance that I hadn't simply disappeared after he'd dismissed me as just the help. "Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I didn't realize you were still here." The casual lie was almost more insulting than the original dismissal. Of course he realized I was still there. He'd seen me sitting in that lobby chair for the entire duration of his presentation. But acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that he'd deliberately chosen to deny knowing me in front of his clients. "I was waiting for your presentation to finish," I said, keeping my voice equally neutral. "You invited me to come see you in action, remember?" I watched his colleagues exchange glances, clearly picking up on some tension they didn't understand. David's assistant looked particularly confused, since she'd met me several times during previous visits and knew I was his mother. "Right," David said, his tone suggesting this was a minor miscommunication rather than a deliberate snub. "Well, it went really well. I'll call you later and fill you in on how it went." He was dismissing me again, more politely this time, but with the same underlying message. I didn't belong in his professional world, and my presence was somehow embarrassing or problematic. The woman who had funded his entire business was being politely ushered away so he could continue building his reputation as a self-made entrepreneur. I nodded and smiled, playing along with his charade one more time. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." I rode the elevator down to the parking garage with my heart pounding and my mind racing. 20 minutes earlier, I had been excited to see my son succeed in the business world I'd helped make possible for him. Now, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship and my place in his life. The drive home gave me time to process what had happened, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the hurt was beginning to transform into something much more dangerous. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating variety that builds slowly and methodically until it becomes unstoppable. I spent that evening in my home office, surrounded by financial documents and business records that told the real story of my son's success, the initial loan that had funded his startup, the ongoing monthly transfers that had helped cover his office lease when cash flow was tight in those early months, the business credit line I'd personally guaranteed when he needed additional working capital. The network of professional contacts I'd quietly connected him with through my own business relationships. David's consulting firm wasn't just funded by my money, it was built on a foundation of financial support that continued long after that first $200,000 check. And now, after 18 months of watching him grow increasingly distant and dismissive, I finally understood how he really saw me. Not as a successful businesswoman who had chosen to support his dreams. Not as a mother who had sacrificed and invested to give him opportunities. I was just the help. And apparently, I always had been. That night, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. If David wanted to treat me like hired help, I was going to show him exactly what happened when the help decided to quit. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night of hard thinking. I made my coffee, sat in my kitchen, and began making a list of every financial connection between my money and David's business. What I discovered was more extensive than I'd even remembered. Beyond the obvious startup loan, there were dozens of smaller transactions that had kept his company afloat during challenging periods. A $15,000 transfer when his biggest client delayed payment for 3 months. $25,000 to cover payroll when he'd overextended on a new hire. Another $30,000 when he needed to upgrade his office technology to land a particularly demanding contract. I'd been so generous with these small loans that I'd stopped keeping careful track of them. Each time David called with a financial emergency, I'd simply transferred the money and made a mental note that we'd settle up later. But later never came. These weren't loans in his mind. They were gifts from a mother who was happy to help however she could. The total amount, when I calculated everything including compound interest, was approaching $500,000. But the financial support was only part of the story. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my business contacts, identifying all the connections I'd facilitated for David without him realizing the source. Marcus Rodriguez, the owner of 3 major restaurant chains who'd become one of David's biggest clients, was someone I'd met through my commercial real estate investments. I'd mentioned David's consulting services during a casual conversation about Marcus's expansion plans, and within a month, David had landed a 6-figure contract to streamline Marcus's operations across all 3 chains. Jennifer Walsh, the CEO of a tech startup that had hired David to help prepare for their IPO, was the daughter of my insurance agent. I'd heard Jennifer mention her company's growth challenges during a dinner party and suggested she might benefit from business consulting services. I'd even given her David's card, though I'd framed it as a casual recommendation rather than revealing our family connection. The networking opportunities I'd created for David were worth far more than the direct financial support. In the business world, relationships are everything, and I'd been quietly opening doors for him through my own professional network for almost 2 years. He thought his success was the result of his own networking skills and business acumen. But the truth was that many of his most valuable clients had come to him through connections I'd facilitated. I spent the morning documenting every financial transaction and business connection, creating a comprehensive record of exactly how dependent David's success was on my resources and relationships. It was sobering to see the full scope of my investment in his career laid out in black and white. I hadn't just given him startup capital. I'd been functioning as his silent business partner, providing ongoing financial support and client development without taking any credit or recognition. By noon, I'd made my decision about how to proceed. I wasn't going to confront David directly or demand an apology for his behavior in the lobby. That would only put him on the defensive and give him an opportunity to minimize what had happened or explain it away. Instead, I was going to let his actions speak for themselves by withdrawing my support and watching what happened to his business when it had to stand on its own merit. The first step was calling my attorney, Patricia Kim, who'd handled all of my business affairs for the past 15 years. Patricia was a sharp woman in her late 40s who specialized in commercial law and had helped me structure many of my real estate investments. She was also someone who understood the importance of discretion in business relationships. "Maggie," Patricia said when I reached her office, "what can I do for you today?" I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the financial aspects rather than the emotional hurt. I wanted Patricia to understand that this was a business decision, not a family dispute that had spiraled out of control. "I need to formally document all of the loans I've made to David's consulting firm," I told her. "And I want to establish clear repayment terms with appropriate interest rates and deadlines." Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I was asking. "Are you sure you want to treat these as formal business loans? Once we create legal documentation, this becomes a very different kind of relationship between you and your son." I'd already considered this. Converting gift-like family support into formal business debt would fundamentally change the dynamic between David and me. But his willingness to dismiss me as just the help had already changed our relationship in ways that couldn't be undone. "I'm sure," I told Patricia. "I want everything properly documented with standard commercial interest rates and repayment schedules." Patricia scheduled a meeting for the following week to begin preparing the loan documentation. In the meantime, she advised me to gather all records of transfers, payments, and any written communication about the money I'd provided to David's business. The goal was to create an airtight legal case that these had been loans rather than gifts, which would give me significant leverage if David's business ran into financial difficulties. While Patricia worked on the legal documentation, I began implementing the second phase of my plan. I started reaching out to the business contacts I'd connected with David, not to cause problems for him directly, but to begin repositioning myself in those relationships. Instead of being the anonymous facilitator who'd helped bring people together, I wanted to establish my own professional identity with these individuals. My first call was to Marcus Rodriguez. I'd been planning to expand my restaurant investments anyway, and Marcus's success with his 3 chains made him an ideal partner for my next commercial real estate venture. "Marcus, this is Maggie Chen," I said when I reached him at his flagship restaurant. "We met through some mutual business connections a few months ago. I'm calling because I'm exploring opportunities to invest in restaurant properties, and I'd love to discuss whether you might be interested in partnering on some real estate development." Marcus remembered me immediately, though he seemed slightly surprised by my call. "Maggie, of course. You recommended that consultant David Brennan to me, and he's been fantastic to work with. His insights on operational efficiency saved us probably $40,000 in the first quarter alone." I felt a twist of irony hearing Marcus praise David's work, knowing that the connection between them existed only because of my intervention. But I kept my voice neutral and professional. "I'm so glad that worked out well for both of you," I said. "David is very talented at what he does. But today I'm calling about a different kind of opportunity. I'm looking at purchasing a commercial property in Bellevue that would be perfect for a high-end restaurant, and I thought you might be interested in discussing a lease arrangement. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and by the end, Marcus had agreed to meet me the following week to look at the property. More importantly, he'd begun to understand that I was a serious real estate investor with significant capital to deploy. The woman he'd dismissed as someone who'd casually recommended a consultant was actually someone who could offer him expansion opportunities worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had similar conversations with 3 other business contacts I'd connected with David over the past 18 months. In each case, I positioned myself as an independent businesswoman exploring investment opportunities without explicitly mentioning my relationship to David. I wasn't trying to undermine his existing contracts with these clients, but I was establishing my own professional credibility in ways that would become relevant later. The most interesting conversation was with Jennifer Walsh, the tech startup CEO whose company was preparing for their IPO. Jennifer had been working with David for 6 months on organizational development and strategic planning, but she'd mentioned during our initial introduction that she was also looking for investors who understood the service industry landscape. "Jennifer, this is Maggie Chen," I said when I called her office. "We were introduced at my insurance agent's dinner party last year, and you mentioned some interesting challenges your company was facing with scaling operations." Jennifer's voice brightened immediately. "Maggie, yes, I remember you. You suggested—" I talked to David Brennan about consulting services, and that's been incredibly valuable. His work on our operational systems has been exactly what we needed to prepare for going public. Again, the irony was almost overwhelming. David's success with Jennifer's company was directly attributable to my introduction, but he'd clearly never mentioned our family connection to her. "I'm so pleased that worked out well," I said. "Actually, I'm calling because I understand you're looking for investors who have experience in service industry operations. I've been building a portfolio of commercial service businesses for the past 20 years, and I'm interested in exploring investment opportunities in the tech sector." The conversation that followed revealed just how much Jennifer's company had grown since David began working with them. They were projecting revenues of $12 million for the current fiscal year, and were planning to raise $15 million in Series B funding to accelerate their expansion. Jennifer was particularly interested in finding investors who could provide strategic guidance about scaling service operations, which was exactly my area of expertise. By the end of our call, Jennifer had invited me to review their investment prospectus and attend a presentation for potential investors the following month. She seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of adding me to their investor group, both for the capital I could provide and for the operational insights I could contribute based on my experience building service businesses. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was building something much more significant than a simple revenge plot against David's dismissive behavior. I was establishing my own professional identity in the business community where David had been building his reputation. Instead of being the anonymous mother who'd facilitated his success, I was positioning myself as a serious investor and business operator in my own right. The third phase of my plan involved gradually reducing the informal financial support I'd been providing to David's business. I didn't want to create an immediate crisis that would obviously trace back to my actions, but I wanted him to start feeling the difference between operating with unlimited family backing and managing a business that had to generate enough cash flow to sustain itself. David's habit of calling me for emergency funding had become so routine that I'd started to anticipate his requests. Every few months, he'd run into a temporary cash flow issue or identify an unexpected business opportunity that required quick capital. He'd call with a casual tone, explain the situation briefly, and I'd transfer the money within hours. From his perspective, I was just a supportive mother who happened to have enough savings to help with business emergencies. The first opportunity to implement this new approach came about 10 days after the lobby incident. David called on a Thursday evening, sounding stressed but trying to maintain his usual casual demeanor. "Hey, Mom," he said. "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening. I've got a quick business question for you." I was sitting in my home office, reviewing financial statements from my apartment complexes, but I kept my voice warm and attentive. "Of course, sweetheart. What's going on?" David launched into an explanation of a new contract opportunity that had just emerged. A major retail chain was looking for consulting services to optimize their supply chain operations, and they wanted to move quickly. The project would require David to hire 2 additional consultants and invest in some specialized software systems. The total upfront cost was around $40,000, but the contract value was worth almost $200,000 over 18 months. It's exactly the kind of high-value, long-term engagement that could really establish us in the retail consulting space, David explained, his excitement evident despite his attempt to sound casual. "The only challenge is they want to start next week, and our cash flow is a little tight right now with the quarterly tax payments and the new office lease." This was the moment I'd been preparing for. In the past, I would have transferred the $40,000 before David finished explaining the situation. But now I found myself thinking about the woman who'd been dismissed as just the help while sitting 20 feet away from a business strategy meeting funded entirely by her money. "That does sound like an exciting opportunity," I said, keeping my tone supportive but introducing a note of hesitation that David had never heard before. "$40,000 is quite a bit, though. Have you looked into business credit lines or other financing options?" There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear David recalibrating his approach. He'd never had to justify these requests before or explore alternative funding sources. "Well, I could look into bank financing," he said, sounding slightly confused by my response. "But that would take weeks to set up, and this opportunity won't wait that long. I was hoping we could handle it the same way we did with the equipment upgrade last spring." The equipment upgrade. Another $15,000 I'd transferred without a second thought when David needed to purchase new computers and software for his growing team. Another small loan that had never been repaid or even formally acknowledged as debt. "I understand the time pressure," I said, "but I think it might be good for your business to establish some traditional financing relationships. It would give you more flexibility for future opportunities and help build your credit history as a company." I could hear David's confusion deepening. This was not the conversation he'd expected to have. For almost 2 years, these requests had been simple transactions. He explained the need, I provided the money, and we both moved on. Now I was introducing complications and suggestions he'd never had to consider. "Mom, are you saying you don't want to help with this?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with assumptions about our relationship and my role in his business success. David had become so accustomed to my financial support that he'd started to view it as an entitlement rather than a gift. The idea that I might have my own financial priorities or concerns had apparently never occurred to him. "I'm not saying I don't want to help," I replied carefully. "I'm saying that $40,000 is a significant amount of money, and I think we should approach it thoughtfully. Maybe we could set up a formal loan with a repayment schedule and interest rate, the way you would with any business financing." The silence that followed was telling. David had never thought about our financial arrangement in terms of formal loans or structured repayment. From his perspective, I was a family member with unlimited resources who was happy to contribute to his success without expecting anything in return. "I guess I hadn't thought about it that way," he said finally, his voice much more subdued than when the call had started. I always planned to pay you back eventually, but I didn't realize you were thinking about it as formal business debt." This was the opening I'd been waiting for. "David, I've been thinking a lot about our financial arrangements lately. When I add up everything I've provided for your business over the past 2 years, it's approaching $500,000. That's a substantial investment in anyone's terms." I let that number settle before continuing. I love you and I'm proud of your success. But I think it's time we put our financial relationship on a more formal footing. It would be better for both of us to have clear terms and expectations." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him calculating the implications of what I was saying. If our casual financial arrangement became formal business debt, he'd be personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars he'd never budgeted to repay. $500,000, he repeated slowly. I mean, I knew you'd helped with the startup costs and some of the smaller emergencies, but I hadn't thought about it adding up to that much. The fact that hadn't thought about it was exactly the problem. David had been so focused on building his business and establishing his professional reputation that he'd never stopped to consider the full scope of what my support had made possible. To him, I was just a generous mother with deep pockets, not a business partner who deserved recognition or formal terms. "I think we should set up a meeting with my attorney next week," I said. "We can work out a reasonable repayment schedule and put everything in writing. It'll be much cleaner for both of us to have formal documentation." David agreed to the meeting, though his enthusiasm for the retail consulting opportunity had clearly diminished. After we hung up, I sat in my office thinking about how dramatically our conversation had differed from his expectations. For the first time in 2 years, David had been forced to confront the reality that my financial support wasn't unlimited or unconditional. The meeting with Patricia Kim the following week was even more revealing. David arrived at her office, looking professional, but noticeably tense. He'd clearly spent time thinking about the financial implications of formalizing our arrangement, and he wasn't comfortable with what he'd discovered. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive summary of all the transfers I'd made to David's business, including dates, amounts, and the circumstances that had prompted each payment. When she laid out the documentation on her conference table, the full scope of my financial involvement became impossible to ignore. "Based on the records your mother provided," Patricia explained to David, "the total amount of financial support provided to your business is $467,000. With appropriate commercial interest rates applied from the dates of each transfer, the current balance would be approximately $515,000. David stared at the documents in front of him, his face pale. Seeing the numbers laid out in formal legal documentation was clearly different from thinking about them abstractly. "I had no idea it had added up to so much," he said quietly. "I mean, I knew Mom had been generous with helping the business get started, but $500,000. Patricia continued with her presentation, outlining several options for structuring the repayment. She could set up a traditional business loan with monthly payments over 5 to 7 years. Alternatively, she could structure it as convertible debt that would give me an equity stake in David's company if he couldn't meet the repayment schedule. The equity option might actually be beneficial for both parties," Patricia explained. "If the business continues to grow at its current rate, an ownership stake could be worth more than simple loan repayment, and it would give your mother some participation in the success she's helped create." I watched David's reaction to this suggestion carefully. The idea of giving me an ownership stake in his business was clearly uncomfortable for him. He'd spent 2 years building his professional identity around being a self-made entrepreneur, and acknowledging me as a business partner would undermine that narrative. "I think I'd prefer to structure it as a traditional loan," David said after a long pause. "I want to maintain full ownership of the company, and I'm confident I can handle the monthly payments." This response told me everything I needed to know about how David viewed our relationship, even when confronted with clear evidence that his business wouldn't exist without my financial support. He preferred to take on significant debt rather than acknowledge me as a true partner in his success. Patricia and David spent another hour working out the details of a 7-year repayment plan with monthly payments of approximately $8,000. It was a substantial financial obligation that would consume a significant portion of David's business profits for years to come. As we left Patricia's office, David seemed subdued and thoughtful. The reality of owing me over $500,000 had clearly shaken his confidence about his business's financial stability. "Mom," he said, as we stood on the sidewalk outside Patricia's building, "I want you to know I'm grateful for everything you've done to help me get started. I just never thought about it in these terms before." I looked at my son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. He was grateful for my help, but only in the abstract way people appreciate gifts they've never had to sacrifice to receive. He'd never considered what my financial support had cost me or what I might have expected in return. "I know you're grateful, David," I said gently, "but gratitude isn't the same as respect or partnership. I've been your silent business partner for 2 years, and I think it's time that relationship was acknowledged properly." The drive home gave me time to process what had happened during the meeting with Patricia. David now owed me over $500,000 with clearly defined repayment terms, but more importantly, he was beginning to understand that his business success wasn't entirely his own achievement. Over the next few weeks, I continued to implement the other elements of my plan. I met with Marcus Rodriguez about the Bellevue restaurant property and ended up structuring a deal that would bring me a substantial return on investment while giving him an opportunity to expand his restaurant empire. Jennifer Walsh invited me to join her company's Series B funding round, and I committed to investing $200,000 in exchange for a small equity stake and a seat on their advisory board. Most significantly, I began establishing my own consulting business focused on helping service industry entrepreneurs scale their operations. My 20 years of experience building profitable businesses, combined with my recent connections in the business community, gave me credibility that had nothing to do with being David's mother. The irony wasn't lost on me that while David had been building his reputation as a business consultant, I was becoming a direct competitor in many of the same markets. The difference was that my expertise was based on actually owning and operating multiple successful businesses, while his was primarily theoretical knowledge gained through education and limited experience. About a month after our meeting with Patricia, David called to give me an update on his business. The retail consulting contract he'd wanted the $40,000 loan for had ultimately gone to another firm because he couldn't secure the financing quickly enough. His monthly loan payments to me were straining his cash flow, and he'd had to turn down 2 smaller opportunities because he couldn't afford the upfront investment they required. "Things are a little tight right now," he admitted during our call, "but I think we'll be fine once some of the longer-term contracts start generating more revenue." I listened sympathetically while privately noting that David's financial challenges were entirely predictable. His business model had been built on the assumption of unlimited access to emergency funding through me. Without that safety net, he was discovering that consulting firms require much more careful cash flow management than he'd previously realized. "Have you considered bringing on an investor or business partner?" I suggested. "Someone who could provide capital in exchange for an equity stake might give you more flexibility than traditional debt financing." David was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it," he said finally, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to give up control of the company. This business is really important to me, and I want to maintain ownership of what I've built." What he'd built. The phrase stuck with me long after our conversation ended. David still thought of his consulting firm as something he'd built independently, despite the legal documentation now proving that every aspect of his business had been funded by my money. He was so invested in the narrative of being a self-made entrepreneur that he couldn't acknowledge the reality of how dependent his success had been on my support. But that was about to change, because while David was struggling to manage his cash flow and maintain his business without unlimited family funding, I was preparing to show him exactly what success looked like when it was built on genuine merit, rather than borrowed capital. The final phase of my plan was already in motion, and David had no idea what was coming. 3 months after David signed the formal loan documentation, I received a call that would set the final act of my plan into motion. Jennifer Walsh's tech startup had successfully completed their Series B funding round, raising $18 million to accelerate their expansion. As one of their key investors, I'd been invited to their celebration event at the Four Seasons downtown, where they'd be announcing their growth strategy and introducing their investor group to potential strategic partners. What Jennifer didn't know was that David's consulting firm was one of the companies that had submitted a proposal to help manage their rapid expansion. His firm had been working with them for 8 months, and this new funding round represented exactly the kind of high-value, long-term engagement that could establish his reputation in the tech consulting space. It was also the kind of contract that could solve his current cash flow problems and give him the financial stability to continue making his monthly loan payments to me. I arrived at the Four Seasons that evening wearing a charcoal gray dress that I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. It was elegant without being flashy, the kind of outfit that commanded respect in business settings without drawing unnecessary attention. I wanted to look like exactly what I was: a serious investor with significant capital and extensive business experience. The event was held in the hotel's largest ballroom, with about 200 attendees representing a mix of investors, potential clients, strategic partners, and media representatives. Jennifer had done an impressive job curating the guest list, bringing together exactly the kind of people who could help her company achieve their ambitious growth targets. I spent the first hour networking with other investors and learning more about the startup ecosystem in Seattle. It was fascinating to see how much the business landscape had evolved since I'd started building my own companies 20 years earlier. The pace of growth and the scale of investment were both much larger, but the fundamental challenges of building sustainable operations remained the same. Around 8 o'clock, Jennifer took the stage to present their expansion strategy and introduce the key partners who would be helping execute their vision. She talked about their plans to triple their workforce over the next 18 months, expand into 3 new markets, and develop additional service offerings that would diversify their revenue streams. We've assembled an outstanding team of advisors and service providers to help us navigate this exciting growth phase, Jennifer announced from the podium. Tonight, I'd like to introduce some of the key partners who will be working with us to achieve these ambitious goals. I watched from the audience as she began introducing representatives from their accounting firm, their legal team, their marketing agency, and several other service providers. Each introduction was accompanied by a brief description of their role in the expansion strategy and their track record of success with other growing companies. Then Jennifer said something that made my heart race with anticipation. We've also engaged Brennan Consulting to help us optimize our operational systems and manage the complexities of scaling our workforce. David Brennan has been working with our team for several months, and his insights have been invaluable in preparing us for this next phase of growth. I turned toward the front of the ballroom and saw David walking toward the stage, looking confident and professional in a navy suit I'd never seen before. He was clearly thrilled to be publicly recognized in front of such an impressive audience, and I could see the pride in his expression as he shook hands with Jennifer and took his place among the other key partners. David's firm will be working closely with our leadership team over the next year to ensure that our operational infrastructure can support our planned growth, Jennifer continued. His expertise in organizational development and process optimization has already helped us increase our efficiency by 30%, and we're excited to continue that partnership as we scale. The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. David had clearly made a strong impression on Jennifer's team, and his work with their company was positioning him for exactly the kind of recognition he'd been seeking in the tech consulting space. But what happened next was something David could never have anticipated. I'd also like to introduce one of our key investors, whose strategic guidance has been instrumental in shaping our expansion plans, Jennifer continued. Maggie Chen has over 20 years of experience building and scaling service businesses, and her insights into operational excellence have been incredibly valuable as we've developed our growth strategy. I felt a moment of pure, crystalline satisfaction as I made my way toward the stage. The same confidence David had displayed just moments earlier was now replaced by shock and confusion as he realized what was happening. His mother, the woman he'd dismissed as just the help 3, months earlier, was being introduced as a major investor and strategic advisor to his most important client. The walk to the stage felt like it lasted forever, though it probably took less than 30 seconds. I could feel the attention of the entire ballroom focused on me. But more importantly, I could feel David's eyes tracking my movement with growing disbelief. When I reached the podium, Jennifer greeted me with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. "Maggie brings a unique perspective to our advisory board," she told the audience. "Her experience building profitable service businesses from the ground up gives her insights that you simply can't get from textbooks or theoretical frameworks." I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at an audience that included some of Seattle's most influential business leaders. In the front row, David stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions I could read like an open book. Shock, confusion, growing comprehension of just how dramatically his understanding of our relationship was about to change. "Thank you, Jennifer," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "I'm excited to be part of this incredible company's journey, and I'm particularly looking forward to working with such a talented team of advisors and partners." I let my eyes meet David's for just a moment, seeing the full weight of realization settling over him. Then I continued with my remarks, speaking about the challenges of scaling service businesses and the importance of building sustainable operational systems that could support rapid growth. One of the things I've learned over 20 years of building businesses is that success isn't just about having good ideas or strong initial execution, I said. It's about having the financial resources, strategic relationships, and operational expertise to sustain growth through inevitable challenges and setbacks. Every word was carefully chosen to establish my credibility as a serious business operator, while subtly undermining the narrative David had built about his own self-made success. I wasn't attacking him directly, but I was making it clear to everyone in that room that I wasn't someone who could be dismissed or overlooked. When I finished my remarks and returned to the audience, David was waiting for me near the back of the ballroom. His earlier confidence had been completely replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and growing panic as he began to understand the implications of what had just happened. "Mom," he said in a low voice, clearly trying to avoid being overheard by the other attendees, "what are you doing here? How do you know Jennifer Walsh?" I smiled at him with the same warmth I'd always shown, as if his question was perfectly reasonable rather than evidence that he'd never bothered to learn anything about my professional life. "Jennifer and I met through mutual business connections several months ago," I said truthfully. "When she told me about her company's growth plans, I was impressed enough to join their investor group. It's exactly the kind of innovative business I like to support." David's face went pale as he processed this information. "You're an investor in Jennifer's company?" "A significant investor," I confirmed. "I'm also serving on their advisory board to help guide their operational strategy as they scale." The implications of this revelation were clearly hitting David in waves. His most important client, the company that represented his best opportunity for long-term financial stability, was now partially owned by his mother. The woman he'd dismissed as just the help was actually in a position to influence whether his consulting contract would be renewed. "I don't understand," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You never told me you were involved with Jennifer's company." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "David, there are a lot of things about my business activities that we've never discussed. You've been so focused on building your own career that you've never shown much interest in what I do professionally." I could see him struggling to reconcile this new information with his long-held assumptions about my life and capabilities. For years, he'd thought of me as someone whose primary identity was being his mother, a supportive figure whose own ambitions and achievements were secondary to his success. The idea that I had my own significant business relationships and investments had simply never occurred to him. "But how did you even know about Jennifer's company?" he asked, still trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. "The same way I know about most business opportunities," I replied. Through my professional network. I've been building relationships in the Seattle business community for over 20 years, David, long before you graduated from college. The networking reception continued around us, but David seemed oblivious to everything except our conversation. I could see him beginning to understand that his perception of my life had been fundamentally flawed, and that his success might not be as independent as he'd believed. "Does Jennifer know we're related?" he asked. "She knows I have a son who works in business consulting," I said carefully. "But I've never specifically mentioned your name or your firm. I prefer to keep my family relationship separate from my business investments." This was technically true, though it omitted the fact that I'd been the one who originally connected David with Jennifer in the first place. I'd decided that particular detail could wait for a more private conversation. David excused himself shortly after that, claiming he needed to follow up with some potential clients he'd met during the networking portion of the evening. But I could see that he was actually overwhelmed by what he'd learned and needed time to process the implications. I stayed at the reception for another hour, continuing to network with other investors and learning more about the Seattle startup ecosystem. Several people approached me to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, and I left the event with business cards from 3 companies that might be good candidates for future investments. The drive home gave me time to savor what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, I'd completely destroyed David's assumptions about my professional capabilities and established myself as a serious player in his most important business relationship. The mother he'd dismissed as just the help was now revealed to be someone with significantly more influence and resources than he'd ever imagined. But this was only the beginning of what I had planned. The next morning, I called Jennifer to thank her for including me in the celebration event and to discuss next steps for my involvement in her company's expansion strategy. "Maggie, I'm so glad you could make it last night," Jennifer said when she answered my call. "The response to your remarks was fantastic. Several people asked me for your contact information afterward. We spent a few minutes discussing the specific ways I could contribute to her company's growth, focusing on operational challenges they were likely to encounter as they scaled their workforce and expanded into new markets. Then, Jennifer brought up something that would prove crucial to the next phase of my plan. "I wanted to get your thoughts on our consulting arrangement with Brennan Consulting," she said. "David's been doing good work for us, but as we scale up, I'm wondering if we need someone with more extensive experience managing rapid growth." This was exactly the opening I'd been hoping for. "What specific challenges are you concerned about?" I asked. Jennifer explained that while David's recommendations had been helpful for optimizing their existing operations, she wasn't sure his firm had the depth of experience necessary to guide them through the complexities of tripling their workforce and expanding into multiple new markets simultaneously. "It's not that his work has been inadequate," she clarified. "It's just that the scale of what we're planning is much larger than anything his firm has handled before. I want to make sure we have advisors who've actually navigated this kind of growth themselves." I listened carefully, recognizing this as both an opportunity and a test of my own character. I could easily undermine David's position with Jennifer's company by highlighting his lack of experience or suggesting that my firm would be better suited to handle their expansion challenges. But that would make me the kind of person who used business relationships to settle personal grievances. Instead, I chose a different approach. "David is very talented, and his educational background has given him excellent analytical skills," I said truthfully. "For the specific challenges you're facing, though, you might benefit from bringing in additional expertise to complement his work, rather than replacing him entirely." Jennifer seemed intrigued by this suggestion. "What kind of additional expertise are you thinking about?" "Someone who's actually built and scaled multiple service businesses," I replied. "Someone who can anticipate the operational challenges you'll face and help you build systems that can handle rapid growth without compromising quality or efficiency." There was a pause as Jennifer considered this suggestion. Then she asked, the question I'd been expecting. Would you be interested in taking on a more formal consulting role with our expansion? Your experience building your own businesses seems like exactly what we need. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, developing a consulting framework that would leverage my operational experience while positioning me as a direct alternative to David's more theoretical approach. I'd be very interested in discussing that, I said. My consulting philosophy is based on practical experience rather than academic frameworks. I've made all the mistakes that growing businesses typically make, and I've learned how to avoid them or recover from them quickly. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss the specific ways I could contribute to her company's expansion strategy. By the time we hung up, it was clear that Jennifer was seriously considering bringing me on as a senior consultant to complement or potentially replace David's role with her company. That evening, David called me with a level of agitation I hadn't heard from him in years. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said without any preliminary small talk. "Of course," I replied, though I suspected I knew what was coming. "Are you trying to take over my consulting contract with Jennifer's company?" The directness of his question surprised me. I'd expected him to approach this topic more cautiously, perhaps by asking general questions about my business activities or my relationship with Jennifer. Instead, he was confronting the issue head-on. "David, I'm not trying to take over anything," I said truthfully. "Jennifer approached me about providing additional consulting services based on my operational experience. She's not looking to replace your work. She's looking to supplement it. But you're positioning yourself as a competitor to my firm," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're using your investment relationship with Jennifer to get consulting, work that should be coming to me." This accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be uncomfortable. I was leveraging my business relationship with Jennifer to establish myself as a consultant, and that did put me in potential competition with David's firm. But I was also providing something David couldn't offer: 20 years of hands-on experience, actually building and scaling the kinds of businesses Jennifer was trying to grow. "David, I've been building service businesses since before you graduated from high school," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. "My consulting services are based on practical experience that you simply don't have yet. That doesn't make me a competitor to your firm. It makes me someone who can contribute different expertise to help Jennifer's company succeed." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him struggling to formulate a response that didn't acknowledge the fundamental truth of what I'd said. "I just don't understand why you didn't tell me you were involved with Jennifer's company," he said finally. "We could have coordinated our efforts or found ways to work together instead of competing against each other." This was perhaps the most revealing statement he'd made since our relationship began to deteriorate. David still thought of me primarily as someone who should be supporting his career rather than pursuing my own professional objectives. The idea that I might have business goals that didn't revolve around his success was genuinely difficult for him to comprehend. "David, I've spent the last 20 years building my own career while supporting yours," I said. "I've provided financial backing, business connections, and professional guidance whenever you needed it. But I've never asked you to coordinate your career decisions with my business activities." I paused to let that sink in before continuing. "Maybe it's time you started thinking about our relationship as a partnership between two business professionals, rather than a support system that revolves around your needs." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. David was clearly processing the implications of what I'd said, and I could sense that he was beginning to understand how dramatically his assumptions about our relationship were going to have to change. When he finally spoke again, his voice was much quieter and more uncertain than when the call had started. "Mom, I think I've made some mistakes in how I've treated you," he said slowly. "I never realized how much your own business activities were, or how much I'd been taking your support for granted." This was the closest David had come to acknowledging the real issues in our relationship, and I felt a flicker of hope that We might be able to rebuild our connection on a more equal footing. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. But acknowledgement is only the first step. The real question is whether you're willing to start treating me as an equal partner in our family and business relationships. David agreed to meet me for dinner the following weekend to discuss our relationship more thoroughly. It was the first time in months that he'd initiated a personal conversation that wasn't related to his immediate business needs. The week between that phone call and our dinner meeting was crucial for setting the stage for what would become the final confrontation between us. Jennifer's company officially offered me a consulting contract to help design their operational systems for rapid scaling. The contract was worth $150,000 over 6 months, with the possibility of extension based on results. More significantly, Jennifer asked me to present my recommendations to her board of directors, which included several influential investors and business leaders in the Seattle area. This presentation would establish me as a recognized expert in operational scaling and position me for additional consulting opportunities with other growing companies. David's monthly loan payment to me was also due that week, and for the first time since we'd formalized our financial arrangement, he called to ask for an extension. "Mom, I'm going to need a few extra weeks to make this month's payment," he said during a brief phone call. "Jennifer's company is transitioning to a new payment schedule for consulting services, and my cash flow is tighter than usual." The irony of this request was almost overwhelming. David was asking for financial flexibility from the same woman whose consulting services were about to replace his as the primary driver of Jennifer's operational strategy. "That's fine," I said, "but I think we should discuss restructuring your payment schedule when we have dinner this weekend. $8,000 a month is clearly putting more strain on your business than either of us anticipated." This was true, but it was also a strategic opening for the conversation I wanted to have about the broader dynamics of our relationship. Saturday evening, David and I met at a quiet restaurant in Bellevue that we'd been going to for family dinners since he was in high school. It was neutral territory where we could have a private conversation without the distractions of either of our offices or homes. David arrived looking tired and stressed in a way I hadn't seen since his early struggles to establish his consulting firm. The financial pressure of the loan payments, combined with the uncertainty about his contract with Jennifer's company, was clearly taking a toll on both his confidence and his health. "Mom, I want to start by apologizing," he said after we'd ordered our meals. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I realize I've been taking your support for granted for a really long time." I nodded, appreciating his willingness to address the issue directly. "I'm glad you're thinking about it, David. But I'm more interested in understanding why it took so long for you to recognize the problem." David considered this question carefully before responding. "I think I got so focused on building my own identity as a business owner that I started to see your support as something that diminished my achievements, rather than something that made them possible." This was a more insightful answer than I'd expected, and it suggested that David was beginning to understand the deeper issues in our relationship. "Go on," I encouraged. "When I told people about my business success, I wanted them to see me as someone who'd built something independently," he continued. "Acknowledging how much help I'd received from you made me feel like my achievements weren't really my own." David paused, looking uncomfortable with what he was about to say next. "And I think part of me was embarrassed about your businesses. When my colleagues talked about their families, they mentioned parents who were doctors or lawyers or executives at major corporations. Saying my mother owned laundromats didn't sound as impressive. There it was, the truth I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. David had been embarrassed by my success because it didn't fit the image he wanted to project to his professional peers. "So when you introduced me as just the help to your clients," I said quietly, "you were protecting your professional image by denying our relationship entirely." David's face flushed with shame. "That was the worst thing I've ever done," he said. I was so focused on impressing those investors that I completely forgot everything you'd done to make that meeting possible. I appreciated his honesty, but I also needed him to understand the full scope of what his dismissive behavior had cost both of us. David, when you called me just the help, you didn't just hurt my feelings, I said. You revealed something about how you view our entire relationship. I wasn't just the woman who'd funded your business. I was someone whose presence was embarrassing enough that you preferred to pretend not to know me. David looked down at his plate, clearly struggling with the weight of what I was saying. I understand now that I was wrong, he said, but I don't know how to fix what I've done. The damage to our relationship feels irreversible. This was the moment I'd been building toward for months. David finally understood the severity of his mistakes and was asking for guidance about how to repair our relationship. But the terms of that repair were going to be very different from what he expected. The relationship we had before can't be repaired, I said. But we can build a new one based on mutual respect and equal partnership. David looked up, hope flickering in his expression. What would that look like? I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me and placed it on the table between us. It starts with complete honesty about our business relationship and our individual capabilities. Inside the folder was a comprehensive breakdown of my business holdings, including my real estate investments, my consulting firm, and my equity stakes in various companies. The total value of my assets was approximately $12 million, making me significantly wealthier than David had ever imagined. David, I'm not just someone who owns a few laundromats, I said as he reviewed the documents. I'm a serious real estate investor and business operator with more than 2 decades of experience building profitable companies. David stared at the financial statements with growing amazement. Mom, I had no idea you were this successful. Why didn't you ever tell me about these investments? Because you never asked, I replied simply. You were so focused on your own career development that you never showed any interest in learning about my professional activities. I let him continue reviewing the documents before delivering the final piece of information that would complete his understanding of our new dynamic. There's something else you need to know, I said. Jennifer's company has offered me a consulting contract to design their operational systems for scaling. The contract is worth $150,000, and it's likely to lead to similar opportunities with other growing companies. David looked up from the financial statements, his face reflecting a mixture of shock and growing comprehension. You're starting your own consulting firm, he said slowly. I already have my own consulting firm, I corrected. And based on my track record of actually building and scaling businesses, I'm likely to be very successful in this market. The implications were clear. I wasn't just David's mother who happened to have some money to lend for his business. I was a direct competitor with significantly more experience and resources than his firm possessed. Mom, are you saying you're going to compete against my business? David asked. I'm saying I'm going to build my own business based on my own expertise and relationships, I replied. Whether that puts us in competition depends on how you choose to position your firm in the market. David was quiet for a long time, processing the complete transformation of his understanding about our relationship and our relative positions in the business world. What happens to my loan payments if your consulting firm starts taking clients away from my business? He asked finally. This was the question that got to the heart of our new dynamic. David was beginning to understand that his financial obligations to me would continue regardless of how successful his own business remained. Your loan obligations don't change based on your business performance, I said. Those are separate from any competition between our firms. David nodded slowly, accepting the reality that his assumption about unconditional family support had been permanently shattered. I guess I need to figure out how to compete with my own mother, he said, with a rueful smile. Or you need to figure out how to differentiate your services in ways that complement rather than compete with what I'm offering, I suggested. The market is large enough for both of us if you're willing to focus on your actual strengths rather than trying to be something you're not. We spent the rest of dinner discussing specific ways David could position his firm to succeed in a market where I would also be operating as a consultant. It was the first business conversation we'd ever had as equals, and despite the circumstances that had led to it, I found myself enjoying the experience of talking with David as a professional colleague rather than just as his mother. When we left the restaurant that evening, our relationship had been fundamentally transformed. David now understood that I was a successful business operator in my own right, not just a supportive mother with resources to share. He also understood that his future success would depend on his own capabilities rather than my willingness to provide unlimited financial support. Most importantly, he understood that respect isn't something that can be taken for granted, even in family relationships. It has to be earned through consistent behavior that acknowledges the value and dignity of other people. 6 months later, Jennifer's company successfully completed their expansion into 3 new markets, guided by the operational systems I'd designed for them. My consulting firm landed 4 additional clients based on referrals from that project, establishing me as a recognized expert in scaling service businesses. David's firm survived the transition by focusing on smaller companies that needed analytical support rather than operational guidance. He never regained his contract with Jennifer's company, but he found a sustainable niche working with startups that weren't yet ready for the kind of comprehensive consulting services I provided. Our relationship improved gradually over that period, built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. David made his loan payments on schedule and even began asking for my professional advice on business strategy questions. I provided guidance when asked, but I no longer offered unsolicited support or tried to solve his problems for him. The most significant change was that David began introducing me properly at business events. Instead of avoiding the topic of my profession or minimizing my achievements, he started referring to me as my mother, Maggie Chen, who owns a successful consulting firm and real estate investment portfolio. It wasn't the relationship either of us had expected to have, but it was built on honesty about who we actually were, rather than assumptions about who we were supposed to be. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely proud of my son, not because of his business success, but because he'd learned to treat me with the respect I'd always deserved. Sometimes the most important lessons come from discovering that the people you've underestimated have been holding the real power all along. David learned that lesson the hard way, but ultimately, it made both of us stronger and more honest about what we had to offer each other and the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.